Mr. Merritt. Good to see you, sir. She almost done up there? Should be down in 10.
I was still holding her coffee when I heard her voice carry across the lobby. Diane was standing near the elevator, one hand on Scott Halford's arm, laughing at something he had said. She did not see me. And then Raymond Cole, the head of security, stepped forward and gave Scott the kind of salute reserved for people who matter, chin up, spine straight, hand sharp at his temple. "Mr. Merritt," Raymond said warmly. "Good to see you, sir." Scott nodded like a man who had been called that name 100 times. "She almost done," Raymond smiled. "Should be down in 10. I stood there in my own wife's building in a lobby full of people who worked for her company, and not one of them had any idea who I was. So who exactly had Diane been telling them I was? If you're new here, this channel tells real stories about the moments that change everything. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My name is Caleb Merritt, and I have spent the better part of 20 years learning how to find things that other people work very hard to hide. I am a forensic auditor for the city of Denver, which means I follow money. I trace it through shell companies and falsified invoices and contracts that were never meant to survive a second look. I have sat across from city officials who lied to my face with complete confidence, and I have learned to recognize the particular stillness that settles over a room when someone realizes the numbers no longer add up in their favor. I am not easily shocked. That is what I told myself as I sat in my car outside Summit Gate Tower, still holding 2 coffees that were going cold and a lemon tart that neither of us was going to eat. I had been married to Diane for 16 years. When we met, she was a project manager at a mid-sized tech firm, sharp and relentless, and convinced that she was meant for something larger than what anyone around her could see. I was finishing my certification in forensic accounting, working nights and weekends, living on coffee and ambition that was quieter than hers, but no less real. We were married within 2 years of meeting. When Diane told me she wanted to build her own company, I did not hesitate. I took the bulk of what I had saved, money I had set aside carefully over 6 years, and I helped her lease her first office space, buy the equipment she needed, and survive the early years when Redmont Technologies came within a quarter of shutting down entirely. I did not do it because I expected to be repaid. I did it because I believed in her the way you believe in someone when you have chosen to build a life beside them. 16 years later, Diane was the CEO of a cybersecurity firm that was about to close the largest acquisition deal in its history. She appeared on magazine covers. She spoke at technology conferences. Her name came up in conversations about the most influential business leaders in Colorado. And I was still the same quiet man I had always been, still doing my work for the city, still coming home to the house we shared, still standing a few steps behind, so she had room to move forward. Diane had told me early on that she preferred to keep our marriage separate from her professional world. Investors, she explained, viewed a CEO's personal life as a liability, a distraction, something to be managed rather than displayed. I respected that. I understood it even. I had never been comfortable at formal events, and she had never pressured me to become someone I was not. So I stayed home. I let her go. I told myself that was what a good partner did. I did not understand until that Friday afternoon exactly what my absence had made possible. I had left work early because Diane was under enormous pressure from the pending acquisition, and I wanted to do something small and concrete to remind her that she was not carrying it alone. The coffee was from the cafe where we had our first date, a narrow place on Larimer Street that still used the same chipped ceramic mugs after all these years. The lemon tart was her favorite. I had not been to Summit Gate Tower in nearly 4 years, and standing in the lobby, I noticed how much it had changed. Higher ceilings, new marble at the reception desk, a security station that looked more like a corporate command center than a front desk. Raymond Cole was stationed near the elevator bank, a broad-shouldered man with the posture of someone who had never fully left the military behind. I had started walking toward the reception desk to ask them to call up to the 32nd floor when I heard Diane's voice and stopped. She was near the elevator with a man in a dark charcoal suit that had not come off any rack. He moved through the lobby the way people move through spaces they consider their own, unhurried, certain, acknowledged. Raymond stepped forward immediately, his right hand snapping up in a salute that I recognized as the kind reserved for people who matter. His voice was clear and warm. He said, "Mr. Merritt, good to see you, sir." The man I would learn his name was Scott Halford. Redmont's director of strategy nodded like a man who had been called that name 100 times. He asked if Diane was almost done upstairs. Raymond told him she should be down in 10 minutes. Scott said he would pull the car around, touched Diane briefly on the shoulder, and walked directly toward the executive parking bay without breaking stride. A receptionist at the front desk looked up and greeted him as he passed, not Scott, not Mr. Halford, but Mr. Merritt. She handed him a manila folder with a label I could read from where I stood, CEO Family Documents Confidential. No one in the lobby reacted. Not a single person looked twice. Raymond returned to his post. The receptionist returned to her screen. The other staff members moved around the space as though nothing unusual had occurred because I realized with a coldness that started somewhere behind my sternum and spread outward nothing unusual had. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding that had happened once and gone uncorrected. The entire building knew Scott Halford as the husband of Diane Merritt, and they had known it for a long time. Diane had stepped back into the elevator without noticing me. I stood there another moment, then walked to the reception desk and asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral, who the man was that had just headed to the parking bay. The receptionist told me that was Mr. Merritt, the CEO's husband, and that he came by most days to pick her up. I thanked her, said I had the wrong building, and walked back out through the front doors. I sat in my car for 53 minutes without starting the engine. I have conducted investigations where the evidence mounted slowly, one anomaly, then another, then a third, until the picture became undeniable. I know what it feels like to sit with information that has not yet fully resolved itself into meaning. What I felt in that parking structure was different. It was not confusion. It was the specific and nauseating clarity of understanding something you would have preferred not to understand. If Raymond had been a single employee who made a careless error, that would have been one thing. If one receptionist had mislabeled a file, that might have been a miscommunication. But this was a building full of people operating under an assumption that had clearly been in place long enough to become routine. That did not happen by accident. Diane came home that evening around 8. She set her bag down on the bench by the door, pulled off her heels, and told me it had been an exhausting day of back-to-back meetings. She asked if I had eaten. She went to change out of her work clothes, scrolling through her phone as she walked down the hallway, and nothing in her voice or her movements suggested that the day had been anything other than what she described. She did not mention Scott Halford. She did not mention anyone. I watched her from the kitchen doorway and I made a decision. In my work, I have learned that there is a particular kind of mistake that investigators make when they have already formed a conclusion. They confront too early. They show their hand before they understand the full shape of what they are looking at and the person across from them. The one who has been managing the deception immediately shifts into damage control. They adjust their story. They offer partial explanations that are technically true, but structurally misleading. They make the investigator feel as though the situation has been resolved when it has only been reframed. I had seen it happen to colleagues who were better qualified than me. I was not going to make that mistake tonight. After Diane went to shower, I went to the reading room, the small space off the hallway that she used to decompress after difficult weeks, lined with books and a lamp that cast a soft amber light. Her work bag was on the chair where she always left it. I am not proud of what I did next, but I am also not going to pretend that I had a better option. I opened the bag. In a zippered interior compartment, I found 3 things that had no reasonable explanation. The first was a backup access card for Summit Gate Tower, a spare by the look of it. The kind kept in case the primary was lost, bearing the name Scott Halford registered under a clearance level labeled Executive Family. The second was a parking remote that matched the color-coded system for the building's leadership bay, the same bay I had watched Scott walk into an hour earlier. The third was a key with the embossed logo of Juniper Row Condominiums pressed into its head. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I went to bed when Diane came out of the bathroom. I lay there in the dark beside her and I did not sleep. The next morning I told her I had an early site visit for work. I drove to Juniper Row Condominiums on the south side of the city. I sat in the lot for a long time looking at the building. a clean, modern structure with underground parking and balconies that caught the morning light. I thought about the 16 years behind me. I thought about the cafe on Larimer Street and the money I had given without hesitation, and the way I had stepped back again and again because I believed that was what love required. I thought about the man in the charcoal suit walking through a lobby that knew his name. Then I got out of the car, walked to the entrance, and put the key in the lock. The door opened. The apartment was not what I expected. I had told myself during the drive over that I was prepared for what I might find. I had built a version of it in my mind, something transactional, something that looked like an arrangement rather than a life. What I was not prepared was how completely ordinary it was. The living room had throw pillows and a broken-in couch and a coffee table with ring stains from mugs set down without coasters. There were houseplants on the windowsill, and someone had been watering them recently because the soil was still dark. The kitchen smelled faintly of the same coffee Diane made every morning at home. It was warm and lived in, and completely unmistakably a home, the kind of space that takes months of daily choices to become. I walked through it slowly, the way I walk through a set of financial records when I know something is wrong but have not yet found exactly where. Diane's clothes hung in the bedroom closet beside Scott's. Her dry cleaning tags were still attached to two blazers I recognized. In the bathroom, her prescription bottles sat on the second shelf medication she had told me she picked up from the pharmacy near our house. There were 2 toothbrushes. There were products she had never kept at home, a particular face cream, a brand of shampoo I had never seen her use in 16 years of marriage. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet from a hotel in Scottsdale, was a printed calendar with both their schedules blocked out in different colors. Below it, a grocery list in Diane's handwriting. On the bookshelf in the hallway, between a row of business books and a framed photograph of a coastline I did not recognize, there was a stack of greeting cards. I went through them one by one. They were addressed to Diane and Scott Merritt. Several bore the names of junior colleagues at Redmont, people well below the board level who had presumably met Scott at company events and accepted without question that he was her husband. Others came from vendors and external partners who had encountered them together at industry functions. In one photograph tucked inside a card, Diane was standing at what looked like a resort property, laughing at something off camera. She was wearing the watch I had given her on our 10th anniversary, a piece I had saved for over 2 years to afford. Her left hand was visible in the frame. Her wedding ring was not on it. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a while. Eventually, I went to the desk near the window. The bottom drawer was unlocked, and inside it was a tabbed folder labeled Post Redmont. I opened it. What I found inside was not a rough plan or a set of scattered notes. It was a structured 18-month document formatted the way Diane formatted everything, clean and deliberate and organized by phase. The first phase was closing the acquisition. The second was collecting her executive performance bonus. The third involved retaining a family law attorney to draft what she called a confidential settlement framework, a document she intended to present to me as a mutual agreement, something I would sign without fully understanding its implications. The fourth phase was a public announcement that we had been quietly separated for some time. The fifth was relocating openly to Juniper Row with Scott once the news cycle had moved on. I photographed every page. I photographed the cards, the calendar, the closet, the prescription bottles. I photographed the parking remote and the spare access card that I had returned to her bag the night before. I did it quietly and methodically, and when I was finished, I left the apartment exactly as I had found it, locked the door behind me, and did not go back. 3 days later, I requested a private meeting with Gerald Whitman. I had chosen Gerald carefully. He was the chairman of Redmont's board, not a personal friend of Diane's, and he had a reputation in the financial circles I moved through for taking governance seriously. I did not go to him as a wronged husband. I went to him as a forensic auditor who had uncovered documentation suggesting that a company executive had used her position to provide undisclosed financial benefits to a personal associate. I laid the materials on the table between us in the order I had organized them, and I let him read without interrupting. Gerald was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then he told me that the board had received an anonymous complaint roughly 14 months earlier, alleging preferential contracting practices involving a consulting firm connected to Scott Halford. Diane had addressed the board directly. He said she had framed it as a retaliatory filing from a disgruntled former employee and had presented enough counter-documentation to close the inquiry without an independent audit. Gerald had believed her. Most of the board had believed her. Looking at what I had brought him now, he said he understood why she had been so prepared. What I had documented went beyond the personal. The consulting firm that had won 3 consecutive Redmont contracts without a competitive bidding process was controlled by Scott's brother-in-law. Scott had received a performance bonus that bypassed the standard independent review. Expenses tied to the Juniper Row apartment furniture utilities, 2 international trips had been logged in Redmont's accounting system as client entertainment. 2 employees who had formally objected to Scott's promotion had been transferred to roles with reduced scope, and in one case eventually pushed out of the company entirely. And Diane had never disclosed her relationship with Scott to the board, despite a standing conflict of interest policy that required exactly that. Gerald told me quietly that depending on what the audit uncovered, the matter might not stay internal. Regulators had an interest in executive misconduct of this scale, and the board would have no choice but to cooperate fully with any external inquiry. Gerald authorized a confidential independent audit before I left his office. Diane found out within 48 hours that I had met with Gerald. I do not know how, whether someone on the board told her, or whether she had her own channels inside the building. What I know is that she was home when I arrived that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone face down in front of her, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen in 16 years. It was not grief. It was not guilt. It was the look of someone who had run a careful calculation and arrived at a number they had not expected. She told me I had just destroyed everything she had spent her life building. She said it the way people say things when they are trying to make the other person responsible for the consequences of their own actions. I let her finish. Then I went to the counter where I had left the folder of photographs I had printed that morning, and I set them on the table between us. The apartment, the closet, the cards, the planning document, all of it arranged in the same order I had shown Gerald. I asked her one question. I asked her why every person in that building believed Scott Halford was her husband. The story she had maintained for 18 months could not hold against that question, and she knew it. She told me that Scott fit the image she needed. She said he understood her world, the meetings, the investors, the language of the room in a way that I never had. She said having me at those events would have required her to spend energy explaining why her husband always seemed uncomfortable, why he never knew anyone, why he stood slightly apart from every conversation. Scott, she said, did not create those problems. Then she said the thing that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. She said Scott was the husband she needed in her professional life, and I was the husband who had helped her build that life in the first place. She offered to end things with Scott immediately. She said she would repay the money that we could enter counseling, that none of what had happened had to become public. I listened to the offer, and I understood exactly what it was. The acquisition was still pending. The board had just opened an audit. If I walked away from the table that night without a resolution, everything she had worked toward collapsed. She was not asking me to forgive her. She was asking me to help her survive the next 60 days. I left the house that night, and I did not go back. I was staying at a hotel near Cheeseman Park when my brother Nathan showed up at the door 4 days later. Nathan is older than me by 6 years and runs a commercial equipment repair business, the kind of work that takes him to event venues and warehouses and conference spaces across the city. He had a look on his face when I opened the door that told me he had not slept well in some time. He came in and sat down without saying much at first. Then he took out his phone and played me a video. It had been recorded 18 months earlier at a fundraising gala held at a venue in the Cherry Creek neighborhood. The footage was shaky shot from behind a pillar, the way you film something when you are not sure you should be filming it. But it was clear enough. Diane was standing with a group of people I recognized as investors, and she had her arm through Scott's, and she was introducing him as her husband. Toward the end of the clip, the two of them moved into a side corridor behind the stage, and Nathan had followed far enough to see them. He had seen enough. Nathan told me he had confronted Diane that same night. She had told him the marriage was over in every way that mattered, that we were waiting for the right time to make it formal, that she and I had both moved on privately and just hadn't made it public yet. Then she told him that our father was in the middle of cardiac treatment and that the shock of a family scandal could genuinely worsen his condition. Nathan believed her. Or he wanted to believe her badly enough that it amounted to the same thing. After our father died 10 months later, the moment to say something had closed over like water, and Nathan had told himself that I must have known, or that Diane would tell me when the time was right, or a dozen other things that were easier than admitting he had made the wrong choice. Near the end of the video, before the footage cut out, there was a brief exchange between Diane and Scott in that corridor. She was telling him not to worry about me attending any upcoming events. She said I would never show up at the office because I believed that a good husband knew when to step back and let his wife take the spotlight. Nathan said he was sorry. He said it more than once, and I could hear that he meant it. But I sat there and I thought about 16 years of stepping back, of staying home, of believing that my absence was a form of love, and I understood for the first time that Diane had not simply taken advantage of a trait I had. She had studied it. She had named it. She had used the most genuine thing about me as the precise mechanism by which she made me disappear. I told Nathan I needed time. He nodded and left without pushing further. The independent audit concluded within 3 weeks. The board found sufficient evidence to suspend both Diane and Scott pending a full investigation. The acquisition was placed on indefinite hold. Several institutional investors withdrew. The employees who had been sidelined over Scott's promotion came forward with their own accounts, and the picture that assembled itself from their testimony was thorough and damning, and exactly what the documents had suggested it would be. Scott retained separate legal counsel within days, and made clear through his attorney that all strategic decisions at Redmont had been made by Diane in her capacity as CEO. The man who had nodded at Raymond Cole's salute and accepted a folder of family documents with complete ease, that man did not hesitate for a moment before pointing every finger he had in her direction. I filed for divorce. Before the first hearing, my attorney discovered that Diane had retained a family law firm 11 months earlier. She had also, during that same period, hired a private investigation firm to monitor my movements, my work schedule, my email patterns, my comings and goings from the city office. My attorney obtained the firm's reports in discovery. Diane had not been tracking me because she suspected I was hiding something from her. She had been tracking me to determine whether I had found the apartment so that she could move assets and establish a separation narrative before I had a chance to respond. In a memo to her legal team dated 9 months before I ever walked into Summit Gate Tower, Diane had described me as emotionally driven, conflict-averse, and likely to accept a generous financial settlement in exchange for discretion. I read that line in my attorney's office in a building on 17th Street on a gray Tuesday morning, and I understood with a finality that felt less like pain than like the last piece of a very long equation resolving itself that our marriage had not ended the afternoon I stood in that lobby. It had been scheduled to end long before I arrived, and I had simply not been informed of the date. The apartment I moved into after the divorce was on the south side of Denver, on a street where the buildings were unremarkable and the neighbors kept to themselves. It had 2 rooms, low ceilings, and a window in the kitchen that looked out onto a parking structure. I chose it because it was available and because I did not have the energy in those first weeks to have opinions about where I lived. I owned a bed, a coffee maker, 4 boxes of books, and the kind of silence that is not peaceful, but simply empty. The divorce settlement was finalized 5 months after I filed. Diane's legal team had been aggressive in the early stages, but the discovery materials, the investigation reports, the asset transfers, the memo in which she described me as someone who could be managed with a large enough check had substantially weakened her position. She retained her personal holdings. I retained what was mine before we married, and a fair division of what we had built together. My attorney told me the outcome was better than most. I nodded and signed the documents and felt nothing in particular about any of it. What I felt in the months that followed was harder to name and harder to manage than anything I had experienced during the investigation itself. I had spent my career learning to trust evidence. Show me the documents, give me the records, let me trace the numbers, and I could find the truth in almost anything. What I had not understood until I was living alone in a 2-room apartment with nothing to investigate was that there are certain kinds of damage that evidence cannot address. I found myself going back through 16 years of memory The way I went back through financial records looking for the moment the numbers had started to diverge from reality. Every anniversary trip, every quiet Sunday, every time Diane had touched my hand at the kitchen table, I examined each one and asked whether it had been real or whether it had simply been part of the management strategy. I could not answer the question. That was the problem. I had the documents. I had the timeline. I knew exactly what she had done and when she had done it. But I could not locate the precise point where her love for me, if it had ever been genuine, had turned into something she was administering. I started checking things I had no reason to check. I reread emails from colleagues looking for subtext that was not there. I declined invitations from friends I had known for years because I could not sit across from anyone without running a quiet audit of everything they said. I did not return Nathan's calls for almost 2 months. My therapist, a calm, direct woman who did not traffic in reassurance, told me early in our work together that what I was doing was not due diligence. It was a way of staying in motion so I did not have to sit with how much I had lost. She was right, and I resented her for it for several weeks before I admitted that she was right. The hardest thing she said to me in one of our sessions during the 4th month was this: the problem had never been that I trusted too easily. The problem was that I had handed Diane the authority to define what I was worth and where I was allowed to exist, and I had done it voluntarily in the name of love over so many years that I had stopped noticing it was happening. My absence from her world had not been a sacrifice. It had been a surrender. And there was a difference between those two things that I had never thought to examine until there was nothing left to protect. I did not rebuild quickly. I want to be honest about that because the honest version of this story is not one where understanding a thing makes it hurt less. It was slow. It was uneven. There were weeks that were better and weeks that pulled back toward the same dark orbit. But I kept going to therapy. I kept going to work. And gradually, without planning it, I started to spend time at a small bookshop called Lantern House Books, on a quiet block not far from my apartment. I went the first time because I needed something to read and did not want to order online. I went back because the place was unhurried in a way that matched how I needed to move through the world. Just then, shelves that required actual looking, a narrow aisle near the back with armchairs that had clearly been sat in by a great many people, and a quality of light in the late afternoon that made it easy to stay longer than intended. The owner, Claire Sutton, ran the place herself with the help of one part-time employee. She was in her mid-40s with the kind of self-possession that does not announce itself. She did not ask me anything personal. She did not ask me anything at all most of the time. The first real conversation we had happened on a Thursday afternoon when I had been standing in front of the same shelf for nearly 20 minutes without picking anything up. Claire came around the end of the aisle, glanced at where my hand had been resting the spine of a book I had not actually been reading, and said without particular ceremony that people usually reached for the second book when they had not actually come in for the first one. I did not answer her, and she did not wait for an answer. She walked back to the register and left me standing there, which was the right thing to do. I went back the following week, and the week after that. We talked about books at first, and then about other things gradually, the way conversations between careful people tend to go. I learned that she had been married once years earlier to someone who had used silence as a form of control, not loudly, not violently, but consistently in a way that had taken her a long time to recognize, and longer still to leave. She did not offer this as a parallel to my situation. She told me because I had asked her a direct question, and she gave me a direct answer which I came to understand was simply how she operated. Claire did not make me any promises. She did not tell me she would never hurt me, or that she was different from other people, or that what was ahead of us would be easier than what was behind me. She showed up when she said she would. She said what she actually thought even when it was not what I wanted to hear. She did not use silence to punish me when I was difficult, and there were days when I was difficult. It sounds like a simple thing. After everything I had come through, it was the only thing. Nathan and I found our way back to each other more slowly and differently than before. He did not push. After I finally returned one of his calls, he did not ask for a conversation about what had happened or an accounting of where we stood. He asked if I needed anything. When I said no, he said all right and that he would check in again next week. He did. He kept doing it for months, and when I stopped saying no to everything, he showed up not with speeches or explanations, but with his tools to fix the heating unit in my apartment that had been making noise since I moved in. He worked for 2 hours without asking to be let into anything beyond the utility closet, and when he was done, he said the blower motor had been on its way out, and that I should have someone look at it again in the spring. Then he left. I had spent a long time being angry at Nathan, not cleanly, the way anger is sometimes clean, but in the complicated way you are angry at someone whose failure was also in part a human one. He had been afraid. He had made the choice that protected the most people in the short term and told himself it was also the right choice in the long term because that is what people do when they are afraid. I understood it. Understanding it did not dissolve the anger, but it changed its shape over time into something I could carry without it defining every interaction between us. We started meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings. We did not talk about Diane. We talked about his business and my work, and eventually about our father in the way we had never quite managed to talk about him while he was still alive. The relationship was not what it had been. It was more careful. I think it was also more honest. I ran into Diane once about 8 months after the settlement. It was a Saturday and ordinary errand, and I turned the corner of an aisle in a grocery store on Capitol Hill, and there she was. She looked different. Not diminished exactly, but reduced to a version of herself that fit into a normal-sized space in a way that her public self never had. She had left Redmont through a negotiated exit that allowed her to avoid criminal prosecution, but cost her the bulk of her performance compensation, her equity options, and the professional reputation she had spent 2 decades building. Scott had terminated contact with her within weeks of the board's decision. The man who had nodded at Raymond Cole's salute and collected a folder of family documents without hesitation had no further use for her once her power to protect him was gone. She saw me. There was a moment where neither of us moved, and then she said that she had lost everything. I looked at her and I noticed what I was not feeling. I was not feeling the satisfaction I had imagined in the early months that this moment might bring. I was not feeling the particular pleasure of watching someone face consequences they had constructed for themselves. I was not feeling much of anything that I could locate as being about her at all. What I felt was something more like distance, the recognition that she occupied a much smaller place in the architecture of my life than she once had, and that this was not something she had done to me. It was something I had slowly and at considerable cost done for myself. I told her I was sorry she was going through a hard time. I meant it the way you mean a thing that is true without being personal. Then I put my hand back on the cart and finished the shopping I had come in to do. On a Sunday in late November, I drove out to Farrell Lake and sat on a bench near the water as the afternoon light came in low and flat across the surface. The trees had mostly let go of their leaves and the park was quiet in the way it gets when the weather turns and the casual visitors stay home. I had a coffee from a place on Colfax and know where I needed to be for the rest of the day, and for a while I just sat there and let the quiet be quiet. I thought about a Friday afternoon in October, the coffee going cold in my hand, Diane's voice carrying across the lobby, Raymond Cole's hand rising in salute toward a man wearing my name. I had stood in that building and felt the floor go out from under me. And somewhere in the months that followed, I had convinced myself that moment was the beginning of everything falling apart. I understood now that I had that backwards. Things had been falling apart for a long time before I walked into Summit Gate Tower. What happened in that lobby was not the collapse. It was the moment I finally saw it clearly enough to do something about it. For most of my marriage, I had believed that loving someone meant knowing when to make yourself smaller. I had treated my own absence as a form of generosity, as though the less space I took up, the more room she had to become what she was capable of becoming. I had been wrong about that, and the wrongness was not Diane's invention. It was mine. She had used it, yes. She had used it deliberately and without much apparent guilt. But I had offered it freely for years because I had confused disappearing with devotion. My phone moved on this bench beside me. Nathan had sent a message asking if I was coming to dinner on Sunday. A few minutes later, a second message arrived, a photograph from Claire taken inside Lantern House books of the armchair near the back window where I usually sat. The chair was empty, and the afternoon light was coming through the glass the same way it always did. Her message said she had left the spot open. I sat by the water a little while longer. Then I stood up, put my coffee cup in the bin near the path, and walked back to the car. I had not forgotten what had happened. I was not going to pretend that everything had healed cleanly, because it had not and probably would not. Not completely, not in the way that leaves no mark. But I was no longer the man who had stood frozen in a lobby holding 2 coffees and a lemon tart, trying to understand why a stranger was being saluted with his name. I knew who I was without that marriage. I knew what I was willing to give and what I was no longer willing to give away. I knew the difference between stepping back and disappearing, and I knew that I would never again confuse one for the other. For the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, that was enough to go on. If this story stayed with you, it might stay with someone else too. The thing about love is that it should never ask you to disappear, and that's a truth worth sharing. Pass this on to someone who needs to hear it, and if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories here about people who found themselves again after losing everything they thought defined them, and we'd be glad to have you around for the next one.